power talks, but precision screams. A single digital projection flickered against the glass walls of the Crestmore Heights hangar, a complex mesh of red stress lines that had baffled the best aerospace minds in the country. To the billionaires in the room, it was a multi-million-dollar headache. To the waitress moving silently through the shadows, it was an elementary error. Rourke Callow, the man who controlled every freight line from Denver to the coast, watched from the back of the room, his green eyes unreadable. He didn't expect the evening's entertainment to come from a girl holding a tray of champagne. "You look smart for a waitress," Brant Holloway mocked, his voice echoing off the private jets. "Let's test it. $1 million if you can solve this." Right now, he didn't expect her to put down the tray. He certainly didn't expect her to point to the one variable his engineers had ignored for 3 years. Avonlea Hart smoothed the front of her white service jacket, her heart steady. She had been invisible for 6 months, an engineering prodigy hiding in plain sight to save her mother's life. She knew the rule: be a pair of hands, not a person. Do not hear the deals, do not see the bribes, and definitely do not look at Rourke Callow. But as Brant laughed, Avonlea realized she was tired of being underestimated. She stepped toward the light. "It's not Latin," she whispered, her voice cutting through the laughter like a blade through silk. "It's physics, and you're looking at it upside down." If you enjoyed Avonlea's brilliant reversal, smash that like button. Comment below. Where are you watching from? Would you have donated the million, or kept it for yourself? Don't forget to subscribe for next week's story about a CEO who becomes a janitor to find out who is stealing his company. Chapter 1. The air inside the Crestmore Heights hangar was thin, expensive, and carried the sharp metallic tang of jet fuel and high-altitude ozone. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, the jagged peaks of the Colorado Rockies were turning a bruised purple as the sun dipped below the snowline. But inside, the atmosphere was white-hot with ego. This was the pinnacle of private aviation, a gala where the guest list was a ledger of the nation's most powerful defense contractors, logistics titans, and tech disruptors. Avonlea Hart moved through the crowd like a ghost in a white service jacket. She was a master of the invisible glide, a skill she had perfected over 6 months of working luxury events to fund the astronomical bills piling up at the oncology center. She kept her head down, her ice blue eyes focused on the liquid levels in the crystal flutes on her tray. To the people in this room, she wasn't an engineering prodigy with a stalled degree. She was just a pair of hands delivering vintage Krug and Wagyu appetizers. In the center of the hangar, beneath the gleaming wing of a prototype long-range jet, sat the gravity well of the evening, the VIP lounge. Brant Holloway, the 37-year-old billionaire founder of Holloway Aerospace, was currently holding court. He was loud, flashy, and wore his success like a weapon. Across from him, seated in a shadow-drenched leather armchair, was Rourke Callow. Unlike Holloway, Rourke didn't need to raise his voice. He sat with a stillness that was predatory, his deep-set green eyes scanning the room with the clinical detachment of a man who owned the very freight lines that kept the country moving. Brant was gesturing wildly at a massive 3D holographic projection floating in the center of the lounge. It was a complex structural model of a turbine assembly, marred by a spiderweb of red stress lines that signaled a catastrophic failure in the simulation. $12 million in R&D, Brant barked, his face flushed with frustration and too much bourbon. "And my team of PhDs tells me the alloy is the problem. They want another year for material testing." He looked up, his gaze snagging on Avonlea as she approached to refill a glass. A cruel, playful light sparked in his eyes. He saw a girl in a uniform, a poor waitress, and saw an opportunity for a spectacle. "You," Brant said, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of the gala. "Waitress, come here." Avonlea stopped, her grip tightening on the silver tray. She didn't look up immediately, but she felt the eyes of the elite shifting toward her. She stepped into the pool of light cast by the hologram. "You look smart," Brant mocked, a sneer curling his lip. "Probably spent a few years at a state school before the real world hit, right?" He didn't wait for an answer. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over a banking app. "I'll tell you what, my engineers are stumped. They can't figure out why this turbine shears at 30,000 feet. I'll wire you $1 million, right now, live on the big screen, if you can tell me what's wrong with this model." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd. Someone whispered, "This should be good," while others pulled out their phones to record the humiliation. Rourke Callow leaned forward slightly, his gaze shifting from the hologram to Avonlea's face. He didn't laugh. He watched. Avonlea looked at the hologram. She didn't tremble. She didn't blush. For exactly 12 seconds, her mind engaged in a way it hadn't since she had walked away from her university labs. She saw the equations, the vector forces, and the heat transfer coefficients, as clearly as if they were written in the air. "Is this model compensating for thermal expansion at altitude?" she asked. Her voice was calm, level, and possessed a sudden, terrifying authority. Brant blinked, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. Yes. Obviously. Avonlea tilted her head, her blue eyes tracing the red stress lines. No, it's not. She stepped closer, setting her tray on a nearby bistro table with a deliberate clink. She pointed a slender finger at the holographic mesh. You're solving for a stress fracture in the wrong quadrant. You think the weakness is here, in the mounting bracket. She moved her finger across the display. But the failure starts here. Your software is trying to reinforce pressure, instead of redistributing it. The laughter in the hangar died an abrupt, violent death. Brant's lead engineer, standing in the second row, stood up so quickly, his chair screeched against the polished floor. You don't need a stronger material, Avonlea continued, her voice gaining a detached, clinical confidence. The alloy is fine. You need a rotational redistribution of the cooling vents, and a lighter, asymmetric mounting plate. It's a geometry problem, Mr. Holloway, not a material one. She paused, her eyes meeting Brant's stunned gaze. And honestly, you need a humility check. A collective gasp rippled through the hangar. Brant's hands were shaking as he pulled up the live simulation on his tablet. He punched in her suggested adjustments, his breathing ragged. The room held its breath as the computer began to crunch the data. Slowly, the spiderweb of red stress lines began to fade. The model turned a steady, peaceful green. The simulation stabilized. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and suffocating. Brant Holloway, the man who owned the sky, looked like he had been struck dumb. Rourke Callow stood up slowly, not out of shock, but out of a dark, profound recognition. He walked toward the girl who had just rewritten a $12 million failure with a single observation, his green eyes burning with a new, dangerous curiosity. The $1 million challenge was no longer a joke. It was the birth of a new power in Crestmore Heights. The air inside the Crestmore Heights hangar was thin, expensive, and carried the sharp metallic tang of jet fuel and high-altitude ozone. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, the jagged peaks of the Colorado Rockies were turning a bruised purple as the sun dipped below the snowline. But inside, the atmosphere was white-hot with ego. This was the pinnacle of private aviation, a gala where the guest list was a ledger of the nation's most powerful defense contractors, logistics titans, and tech disruptors. Avonlea Hart moved through the crowd like a ghost in a white service jacket. She was a master of the invisible glide, a skill she had perfected over 6 months of working luxury events to fund the astronomical bills piling up at the oncology center. She kept her head down, her ice blue eyes focused on the liquid levels in the crystal flutes on her tray. To the people in this room, she wasn't an engineering prodigy with a stalled degree. She was just a pair of hands delivering vintage Krug and Wagyu appetizers. Life hadn't always been silver trays and silent service. Just a year ago, Avonlea's world had been defined by the smell of pine needles and the hum of a different kind of machinery in rural Montana. She had grown up under big skies, her hands stained with engine oil as she helped her father maintain the bush plains that were the lifelines of their small community. It was there, amidst the sub-zero winters and the raw necessity of fixing what was broken, that her mind had developed its unique rhythm. She didn't just see a machine, she saw the stresses, the thermal loads, and the elegant mathematics of flight. That talent had earned her a full-ride scholarship to one of the most prestigious engineering programs in the country. She had been the girl who could visualize a structural failure before the computer models even finished running. But the universe had a way of grounding those who flew too high. Her mother's diagnosis had been the sudden, violent stall she never saw coming. Pausing school wasn't a choice. It was a reflex. Now, instead of designing the next generation of aerospace turbines, she was calculating the exact moment to refill a billionaire's glass, so he wouldn't have to look up and acknowledge her existence. In the center of the hangar, beneath the gleaming wing of a prototype long-range jet, sat the gravity well of the evening, the VIP lounge. Brant Holloway, the 37-year-old billionaire founder of Holloway Aerospace, was currently holding court. He was loud, flashy, and wore his success like a weapon. Across from him, seated in a shadow-drenched leather armchair, was Rourke Callow. Unlike Holloway, Rourke didn't need to raise his voice. He sat with a stillness that was predatory, his deep-set green eyes scanning the room with the clinical detachment of a man who owned the very freight lines that kept the country moving. Avonlea approached their table, her expression a mask of calm, unreadable efficiency. She could hear the condescension in Holloway's voice as he bragged about his latest prototype, a jet that promised to redefine transcontinental travel. She also felt the weight of Rourke Callow's gaze. It didn't feel like the others. Most men in this room looked through her. Rourke looked at her, as if he were cataloging the way she stood, the way her ice-blue eyes stayed fixed on her task, and the unnatural stillness of her hands. As she reached for a discarded napkin, her pale skin caught the light of the 3D holographic projection floating in the center of the lounge. It was a complex structural model of a turbine assembly, marred by a spiderweb of red stress lines that signaled a catastrophic failure in the simulation. Avonlea's mind instinctively shifted. She felt the old, familiar hum of equations beginning to fire in her prefrontal cortex. She saw the flaw instantly, a thermal expansion oversight so glaring it made her teeth ache. But she lowered her eyes. She was a waitress. She was invisible, and in the sovereign state of Crestmore Heights, silence was the only thing keeping her mother's treatment funded. She turned to walk away, the ghost of Montana and the weight of her stalled dreams following her back into the shadows of the hangar. Chapter 2. The air in the hangar seemed to crystallize, every guest frozen in a tableau of high society shock. Brant Holloway's smirk had been replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure disbelief. He looked at his tablet, then at the massive green simulation hovering in the air, and then back at the girl in the white service jacket. The red lines, the digital representation of a $12 million failure, were gone. Avonlea felt the heat of the room's collective gaze, but her pulse remained steady. The math didn't lie, and once she had allowed herself to see the problem, she couldn't unsee the solution. She stood her ground, her ice-blue eyes fixed on the stable model. She wasn't looking for praise. She was merely acknowledging a fact of physics. The red stress line, Brant whispered, his voice cracking. It's completely flat. The oscillation harmonics are stabilized. From the second row of the gathered elite, a man in a charcoal suit stood up abruptly. He was Holloway's chief technical officer, a man whose credentials spanned 3 decades of aerospace dominance. He pushed past a senator to reach the holographic display, his eyes darting across the new parameters Avonlea had dictated. "She's right," the CTO murmured, his voice carrying through the silent hangar. "We were looking at the mounting bracket as a rigid point, but at 30,000 feet, the temperature differential creates a localized expansion that shifted the load onto the secondary vents. By lightening the alloy and redistributing the vents asymmetrically, she's allowed the heat to bleed off before the stress can accumulate." He looked at Avonlea, his expression a mix of professional awe and deep confusion. "Who are you?" Avonlea didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence was broken by the sound of a heavy leather chair creaking. Rourke Callow stood up. He didn't move with the frantic energy of the engineers, or the theatricality of Holloway. He rose with a slow, deliberate grace that drew every eye in the room to the back of the VIP lounge. He adjusted the cuffs of his midnight blue suit, his broad frame casting a long, intimidating shadow across the polished hangar floor. He walked toward Avonlea, the crowd parting before him like a dark sea. He stopped 3 feet away from her. Up close, his green eyes were the color of a pine forest in winter, deep, cold, and observant. He didn't look at the hologram. He looked at the girl. He looked at the faint freckles across her nose, and the way her hands, though pale, were steady enough to perform surgery. "You're an engineer," Rourke said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered in a baritone that hummed with a quiet power. "I was," Avonlea replied, her voice matching his for composure. Rourke's gaze flicked to the small silver pin on her lapel, a standard event staff marker, and then back to her face. He saw the intelligence that she had tried so hard to mask, the fire that burned beneath the invisible exterior. He turned his head slightly toward Brant Holloway, who was still clutching his tablet as if it were a life raft. "The challenge was for $1 million, Brant," Rourke said softly. The threat wasn't in the volume of his voice, but in the absolute certainty of his tone. "Transfer the money," Brant stammered, his face turning a mottled red. "Rourke, come on. It was a joke. A test of character. I can't just wire $1 million to a waitress because she got lucky with a guess." Rourke took a single step closer to the billionaire. The air around them seemed to drop in temperature. "I don't care if she guessed, or if she's a god. You gave your word in front of the most powerful people in the state. In my world, a man's word is his only currency. If you don't pay her, you're bankrupt in every way that matters." The room held its breath. Phones were still recording, their lenses capturing the moment the most feared logistics mogul in the West put his foot on the neck of a tech giant for the sake of a girl who had been invisible 10 minutes ago. Brant looked at the crowd, at the cameras, and finally, at Rourke's unyielding green eyes. His thumb shook as he tapped the screen of his phone. Avonlea's phone, tucked into the pocket of her black slacks, vibrated. The chime of a confirmed wire transfer echoed in the quiet hangar. A sound that signaled the end of her mother's medical debt and the beginning of a storm she hadn't prepared for. Rourke turned back to Avonlea. He didn't smile. He didn't congratulate her. He simply watched her, as if he were waiting to see what the girl who just broke the Ice King's room would do with the power she had just seized. Avonlea pulled her phone from her pocket, looked at the balance, and then looked back at the room of vultures. The thermal variable had been solved, but the real pressure was just beginning to rise. Chapter 3. The digital chime of the transaction confirmation was a small sound, but in the vacuum of the hangar, it carried the weight of a thunderclap. Brant Holloway's face was a map of humiliation, his skin a splotchy, uneven red that clashed with the expensive silk of his tie. He stared at his phone, his thumb still hovering over the screen as if he could somehow claw the $1 million back from the ether. Around him, the gathered elite of Crestmore Heights stood in a paralysis of shock. The Ice King's decree had been executed, and the social hierarchy of the evening had been decimated by a waitress with a penchant for thermal dynamics. Rourke Callow did not wait for the room to recover. He did not offer a polite nod to the senator, or a parting word to the defense contractors who had been vying for his attention all night. His focus remained singular, locked onto Avonlea Hart with an intensity that made the surrounding opulence feel like a cardboard set. He saw her tuck the phone back into the pocket of her slacks, her expression returning to that unreadable, ice-blue calm. She didn't gloat, she didn't tremble, she simply picked up her empty silver tray, a servant reclaiming her tools, and turned toward the service exit. "The gala isn't over, Callow," Brant called out, his voice pitched an octave too high, a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. "We still have the auction for the jet." Rourke didn't even turn his head. "The auction ended when you proved your word was worth less than the alloy in your planes, Brant. The king of freight doesn't do business with debtors." With those words, Rourke turned and followed Avonlea. His stride was long and purposeful, his broad shoulders cutting through the crowd like the prow of an icebreaker. Avonlea was already pushing through the double steel doors that led to the service corridor, a world of industrial linoleum and fluorescent humming that sat in stark contrast to the velvet and champagne of the hangar. She heard the heavy thud of the doors swinging open behind her, the rhythmic, heavy click of expensive leather soles on the hard floor. She stopped at the edge of the employee locker room, her back to him. The adrenaline was finally beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She had $1 million. Her mother's debt was gone. But she had also stepped into the light, and she knew enough about men like Rourke Callow to know that they never gave anything away for free, even if the money came from someone else's pocket. "You're going to need a security detail," Rourke said, his voice echoing in the narrow corridor. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a logistical assessment. He stopped a few feet behind her, close enough that she could smell the faint, masculine scent of sandalwood and cold mountain air. Avonlea turned slowly. She looked up at him, her pale skin appearing almost translucent under the harsh flickering of the overhead lights. "I'm going to need a bus ticket, Mr. Callow. And then I'm going to need to be left alone." Rourke's green eyes narrowed, his brow furrowing as he studied her. He had spent his life managing the movement of goods across vast, dangerous territories. He understood value. He understood leverage. But he was looking at a woman who had just been handed a fortune and looked as though she wanted to throw it into the snow. "You just humiliated a billionaire in front of his peers and his board of directors," Rourke said, his baritone dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Brant Holloway is a small man with a very long memory. He won't just let you walk back to Montana with his reputation in your pocket. In this city, money isn't a shield unless you have the muscle to hold it up." Avonlea's grip on the silver tray tightened. "I've spent 6 months being invisible, Mr. Callow. I know how to disappear." "You were invisible because you were silent," Rourke countered, taking a step closer. The sheer physicality of him seemed to shrink the hallway. "But you spoke. You showed them what's inside your head, Avonlea. A mind like yours is a strategic asset. And in Ironvale, people don't let assets walk away." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a card, heavy black cardstock with a single embossed silver crest. No phone number, no name, just a symbol of the Callow logistics empire. He held it out to her. "My driver is waiting at the north gate," he said. "He will take you wherever you need to go. If you see a black sedan following you, and you will, call the number on the back of that card. It rings directly to me." Avonlea looked at the card, then at the man holding it. She saw the Ice King, the Mafia boss who controlled the western states, and for the first time, she saw something else. It wasn't pity, it was a dark, profound respect. She took the card, her fingers brushing his, and felt a jolt of heat that had nothing to do with the thermal expansion of turbines. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why do you care what happens to a waitress?" Rourke's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened to the color of the deep woods. "Because for the first time in years, someone in that room told the truth without asking for permission first. And because I want to see what else you can solve when you're not holding a tray." He didn't wait for her to thank him. He turned and walked back toward the hangar, leaving Avonlea alone in the flickering light of the corridor. She looked down at the $1 million confirmation on her phone, and the black card in her hand. The king of freight had demanded the transfer, and now, he had demanded her attention. The gala was over, but the game had just reached its most dangerous altitude. Chapter 4. The cold mountain air hit Avonlee's face like a physical wake-up call as she stepped out of the service entrance. The $1 million sat in her account, a digital ghost of a fortune, but it felt heavy, tainted by the mockery of Brant Holloway and the predatory silence of the elite. She didn't head for the employee parking lot. Instead, she sat on a concrete bench, the black card Rourke had given her tucked into her palm, and opened her banking app. With a few steady taps, she initiated a transfer. She didn't send it to her personal savings. She didn't buy a ticket back to Montana. She directed the entire 7-figure sum to the Crestmore Memorial Pediatric Oncology Wing, specifically for the Patient Legacy Fund. It was the fund that covered families who, like hers, had been forced to choose between a mortgage and a life-saving infusion. By the next morning, the city of Crestmore Heights wasn't just reeling. It was in a state of atmospheric shock. The story had leaked before the sun hit the peaks. It wasn't just that a waitress had outsmarted a billionaire. It was that she had treated his life-changing wealth as if it were pocket change, tossing it toward the sick and the forgotten without a second thought. Social media was a wildfire of grainy cell phone footage from the hangar, and the local news cycle had rebranded her from the invisible waitress to the angel of the hangar. Avonlea was sitting in a quiet corner of a local diner, her hood pulled low, watching the news ticker on a wall-mounted TV, when the seat across from her was occupied without a word. She didn't need to look up to recognize the scent of sandalwood and the sudden, heavy shift in the air. Rourke Callow sat there, dressed in a casual but impeccably tailored black overcoat, a cup of black coffee appearing in his hand, as if summoned by sheer will. "The hospital board is in a frenzy," Rourke said, his baritone low enough that it didn't carry past their booth. "They've never had a single anonymous donation of that size. You just funded 5 years of chemotherapy for every child in that wing." Avonlea finally looked up. Her ice blue eyes were tired, but they held a defiant spark. "It was never my money. It was a tax on Brant Holloway's arrogance. I just decided where the tax should be paid." Rourke studied her, his green eyes tracing the sharp, intelligent lines of her face. He didn't look impressed. He looked intrigued. "You still haven't paid your mother's bills, Avonlea?" "I checked. The debt at the main center is still active." "I'll find another way," she said firmly. "I won't use blood money to save her, not that kind." Rourke leaned forward, his broad frame casting a shadow over the table. "Holloway is moving to have the donation frozen. He's claiming, quote, diminished capacity or fraudulent inducement because you're not a certified engineer. He wants his $1 million back, and he wants you silenced for the damage you did to his stock price this morning." Avonlea's jaw tightened. "He can try. He will succeed," Rourke countered, "unless you have a different kind of protection. I'm not offering you a security detail this time, Avonlea. I'm offering you a job. My logistics network is facing a series of structural failures that my own analysts can't explain. I have a fleet of cargo planes grounded in 3 states because of phantom engine stalls." He slid a tablet across the table. It showed a map of the western states, dotted with red icons of grounded aircraft. "I don't want a waitress. I want the engineer who saw a expansion flaw in 12 seconds. You fix my fleet, and I will handle your mother's debt personally. Not through a charity but as a business expense. And I'll make sure Brant Holloway never speaks your name again." Avonlea looked at the map, then at the man. This wasn't a challenge. It was an alliance. Rourke wasn't offering her a gift. He was offering her a seat at a very dangerous table. "You're a mafia boss, Mr. Callow," she whispered. "People like me don't work for people like you." Rourke didn't blink. "People like you are the only reason people like me survive the winter. You want to save your mother? You want to stay in school? Stop being a martyr and start being a partner." He stood up, leaving his coffee untouched. "My car is outside. You can go back to the service entrance of the next gala, or you can come with me and start solving problems that actually matter." Avonlea looked at the tablet, the red icons blinking like a heartbeat. The city was reeling. The money was gone, and the king of freight had just offered her the only thing she couldn't buy. Way back to her true self. She stood up, tucked her hair behind her ear, and followed him into the cold morning light. The angel was done with charity. It was time to build a fortress. Chapter 5. The ascent to the summit of Ironvale Tower felt like leaving the atmosphere of the known world. The elevator was a silent, pressurized capsule of brushed titanium that bypassed 60 floors of corporate bureaucracy to deliver Avonlea into the literal and metaphorical clouds. When the doors slid open, there was no lobby, no receptionist, and no small talk. There was only the glass fortress, a sprawling multi-level command center that looked less like a corporate office and more like a high-altitude combat information center. Floor-to-ceiling panes of reinforced glass offered a 300-degree view of the Colorado skyline, but the real landscape was digital. In the center of the room, a sunken circular pit held a massive, glowing table that projected a live topographic map of the western United States. Thousands of tiny pulsing lights crawled across the terrain, white for trucks, blue for trains, and gold for the airborne fleet. It was the circulatory system of a dozen states, and Rourke Callow was the heart that pumped the blood. Avonlea stepped onto the glass floor, her sneakers squeaking slightly against the pristine surface, a sound that felt like sacrilege in a room this quiet. Rourke moved ahead of her, his overcoat gone, revealing the broad, powerful frame of a man who looked like he could carry the weight of the entire map on his shoulders. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew she was. The Ice King didn't lead, he moved, and the world adjusted its orbit. "This isn't just logistics, is it?" Avonlea asked, her voice hushed. She walked to the edge of the sunken pit, her eyes drawn to the clusters of red icons flashing like warning flares across Nevada and Utah. "It's a war of attrition," Rourke replied, his baritone resonating in the cavernous space. He stood at the edge of the table, his green eyes reflecting the amber glow of the map. "In my world, a 10-minute delay in a shipment isn't a customer service complaint. It's a breach of contract that costs lives. When a plane goes down in my territory, it's not just an accident, it's a message." He tapped a sequence on a glass console, and the map zoomed in on a specific hangar in Salt Lake City. 6 planes, 6 identical engine stalls during the climb-out phase. "My mechanics found nothing. My software engineers found no bugs. But you," he looked at her, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "You saw a thermal variable in a prototype that 5 PhDs missed. I want to know if these stalls are mechanical, or if someone has figured out how to use the physics of the Rockies against me." Avonlea leaned over the table, her mind already beginning to filter the noise of the room into the clean, cold logic of engineering. She looked at the telemetry data scrolling in the margins of the projection. Wind speeds, altitude, fuel temperature, exhaust gas temperatures. She felt the old hum in her prefrontal cortex, the way her brain instinctively mapped the relationships between moving parts and environmental stresses. "You're not looking for a mechanic, Rourke," she said, using his name for the first time without the shield of a title. "You're looking for an architect. These aren't stalls. They're forced compensations." She pointed to a specific data string. "Look at the air-to-fuel ratio the second before the failure. It doesn't drop. It spikes. The engines aren't starving for air. They're being choked by a false pressure reading." Rourke stepped closer, the heat from his body radiating through his custom-made suit. For a moment, the vastness of the glass fortress seemed to shrink, until there was nothing but the map and the two of them. He watched her fingers dance over the glass, the way her ice-blue eyes sharpened as she found the pattern in the chaos. He had spent years looking for people he could trust, people who could see what he saw, but Avonlea saw more. She saw the why, behind the what. "If someone is spoofing the sensors," Rourke said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low frequency, "they're doing it from inside the fleet's own encrypted network. Or they found a structural resonance," Avonlea countered, her voice gaining the authority she had once held in university labs. "If you vibrate a specific sensor, at a specific frequency using ultrasound, it reports a false density. The computer thinks the air is too thick, cuts the fuel, and the engine dies. It's elegant, it's invisible, and it's exactly what I would do if I wanted to bring you down without leaving a trace." Rourke's jaw tightened, the realization that his empire was being picked apart by a ghost of physics, one that only a waitress from Montana could identify, was a bitter pill. But his respect for the woman beside him outweighed his pride. He turned away from the map and looked at her, truly seeing the angel of the hangar as the strategic weapon she was. "The glass fortress was built to keep people out," Rourke said, his gaze locking onto hers. "But it seems I've been keeping the wrong people in. Welcome to the war room, Avonlea. Let's see if we can find the frequency that breaks them back." In the silence of the fortress, high above the world that had tried to silence her, Avonlea felt the final tether to her old life snap. She wasn't just fixing planes, she was designing a counterattack. The waitress was dead, and the architect of Ironvale had finally arrived. Chapter 6. The silence in the glass fortress was clinical, broken only by the low-frequency hum of the servers, and the occasional sharp click of Avonlea's keyboard. She had spent the last 6 hours submerged in the raw telemetry data of Rourke's grounded fleet, her mind acting as a filter for the thousands of variables that shouldn't have mattered but did. Rourke stood a few feet behind her, a silent sentinel in the dim amber glow of the war room, his presence a heavy, grounding force that didn't distract her. It sharpened her. Avonlea's eyes, reflected in the transparent glass of the primary terminal, were narrow and intense. She wasn't looking at the engines anymore. She was looking at the communication between the plane's internal sensors and the digital flight control system. She pulled up a side-by-side comparison of 3 different phantom stalls that had occurred in the last 48 hours. "There," she whispered, her voice raspy from hours of silence. She tapped the glass, highlighting a specific micro-fluctuation in the manifold pressure readings. "It's not a sensor failure, Rourke. And it's not a spoofed signal from the outside." Rourke stepped closer, his shadow falling over her workstation. He leaned down, his face inches from hers as he studied the scrolling code. Explain it to me in logistics, Avonlea, not physics. It's a deliberate flaw in the architecture of the new cargo jets, she said, her finger tracing a recurring spike in the ultrasound frequency data. These planes were designed with a safety feature, meant to prevent overpressurization at high altitudes. But someone modified the secondary harmonic dampener on the sensor housing. They didn't break it, they tuned it. She pulled up the technical schematics for the fleet's new Pratt & Whitney engines. At a specific engine RPM combined with the thinning air of the Rockies, the housing begins to vibrate at a frequency of 42 kHz. It's a frequency the human ear can't hear, but the sensor interprets it as a physical pressure surge. The computer thinks the engine is about to explode, so it triggers an emergency fuel cutoff. It's a ghost in the machine, Rourke, a kill switch hidden in the very physics of the design. Rourke's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking with a suppressed, lethal rage. That fleet was $1 billion acquisition from Vance Aerospace. They were supposed to be the most secure cargo vessels in the Western Hemisphere. Vance Aerospace, Avonlea repeated, her eyes widening. Brant Holloway's primary partner, in the defense sector. The realization hit the room like a physical shock. The stalls weren't random acts of God or simple sabotage. They were a long con. By selling Rourke a fleet with a built-in undetectable structural flaw, Holloway's partners had ensured that they could ground Rourke's entire logistics empire whenever they chose. They didn't need to hijack his planes, they just needed to wait for the altitude to do the work for them. They sold you a fleet of glass wings, Avonlea said, her voice trembling with the weight of the discovery. And they expected you to be too busy blaming the weather or your mechanics to ever look at the harmonics. Rourke turned away from the terminal, his gaze fixed on the snow-capped mountains outside the fortress. He looked like a man who had just realized his castle was built on a fault line. But when he looked back at Avonlea, there was no fear in his green eyes, only a cold, shimmering respect. They underestimated the Waitress, Rourke said, his baritone dropping to a frequency that felt like a promise of war. They thought I would look at the ledger, and they thought you would look at the tray. They didn't plan for an architect who can hear the sound of a lie in an engine. He walked to the central table and cleared the topographic map with a single swipe of his hand. In its place, he brought up the corporate hierarchy of Vance Aerospace. If this is a structural flaw, can you fix it? Or are my planes nothing more than expensive scrap metal? Avonlea stood up, her ice blue eyes reflecting the glowing schematics. She felt the old familiar surge of the engineer, the one who fixed what was broken, the one who fought back with logic. I can't change the alloy in the hangar, but I can write a software patch that ignores that specific frequency. I can bypass their kill switch. She paused, a grim smile touching her lips. But if I were you, I wouldn't just fix them. I'd use that frequency to track exactly who is trying to trigger it. If they try to ground your fleet again, we won't just stay in the air. We'll know exactly where the signal is coming from. Rourke nodded, a dark, lethal satisfaction crossing his face. Do it. Fix the fleet, Avonlea. And then, we're gonna show Brant Holloway what happens when you try to ground a king. In the heart of the glass fortress, the sabotaged fleet was no longer a liability. It was a bait. Avonlea sat back down at the terminal, her fingers flying across the keys, rewriting the future of Rourke's empire one line of code at a time. The vultures had circled a wounded beast, but they had forgotten that even a grounded predator has teeth. And now, thanks to the girl they had mocked, the beast was ready to fly again. Chapter 7. The neon lights of the Crestmore Heights skyline bled into the rain-slicked streets like spilled ink. Avonlea stepped out of the high-security transport Rourke had arranged, her mind still buzzing with the harmonics of the sabotaged fleet. She was only halfway to the entrance of her apartment building when the atmosphere shifted. The familiar mountain wind was cut short by the presence of a sleek silver hypercar idling at the curb, a vehicle that cost more than the entire oncology wing she had just funded. The gull-wing door hissed open, and Brant Holloway stepped out. Gone was the boisterous drunk of the gala. In his place was a man whose vanity had been sharpened into a serrated edge. He looked at Avonlea not as a person, but as a glitch in his multi-billion-dollar code that needed to be patched out. You've had quite a week, Avonlea, Brant said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. He leaned against the carbon fiber frame of his car, tapping a heavy gold signet ring against the metal. The angel of the hangar, the girl who gave away $1 million to make a point. It's a touching story. Truly. Avonlea stopped, her hand tightening on the strap of her laptop bag. She felt the weight of Rourke's black card in her pocket, a silent anchor. What do you want, Brant? The hospital already processed the transfer. The money is gone. The money was never the issue, Brant snapped, his composure slipping for a fraction of a second. The issue is the data. You didn't just solve a model. You exposed a proprietary vulnerability that my partners and I have spent years perfecting. You've turned $1 billion asset into a liability. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope, tossing it onto the hood of his car. There's $5 million in there. Offshore accounts, untraceable. It's 5 times what you gave away. All you have to do is sign a non-disclosure agreement and a confession, stating that your discovery at the gala was a staged stunt, a prank meant to test the market's reaction. Avonlea looked at the envelope. She thought of the red stress lines on the turbine. She thought of the children in the oncology wing. And she thought of the glass wings he had sold to Rourke, designed to fall out of the sky on his command. "You're not buying my silence, Brant," she said, her voice echoing with a cold, engineered precision. "You're buying your own safety. Because you know that if I keep looking at those engines, I won't just find the flaw. I'll find the fingerprints." Brant's expression darkened, the last of his tech genius persona falling away to reveal the vulture beneath. He stepped closer, his shadow looming over her. "You think Rourke Callow is your protector? He's a logistics man, Avonlea. He moves boxes. I move the world. If you don't take the money, you're not just a waitress anymore. You're a target. And targets in this city tend to have very short lifespans." Avonlea didn't flinch. She took her phone out and held it up. The screen was black, but a small blue light was pulsing in the corner. "Rourke isn't just a logistics man, Brant. He's the man who owns the network you're standing on. And he's been listening to every word of this conversation." Brant froze. His eyes darted to the phone, then to the dark windows of the black SUV parked a block away, the one he hadn't noticed until now. The gold light of the dashboard within flickered, revealing the silhouette of a man who looked like he was carved from the mountain itself. "The grudge is yours, Brant," Avonlea whispered, stepping around him. "But the sky belongs to us now." As she walked into the building, the silver hypercar roared to life, tires screaming against the asphalt as Brant fled the scene. He had tried to buy her life, but he had only succeeded in proving his own desperation. Avonlea climbed the stairs, her heart hammering but her mind clear. The billionaire's grudge had been declared, but as she looked at the encrypted data on her screen, she realized she wasn't the prey. She was the one holding the map to his destruction. Chapter 8. The black sedan didn't take Avonlea home. Instead, it wound higher into the foothills, leaving the neon glow of the city behind, until the only light came from the moon, reflecting off the fresh Colorado powder. Rourke sat beside her in the back seat, his presence a silent, heavy weight. He hadn't spoken since Brant Holloway's silver car had screeched away from her apartment, but the tension in his broad shoulders told her the night was far from over. When the car pulled to a stop, they weren't at the glass fortress, but at a secluded, glass-fronted cabin that seemed to grow out of the granite mountainside. Inside, the cabin smelled of aged cedar and wood smoke. Rourke moved to a heavy oak desk in the corner, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, he lit a small desk lamp that cast long amber shadows across the room. He reached into a hidden compartment in the desk and pulled out a leather-bound folder, its edges frayed and grayed with time. "You asked me why I care about a waitress," Rourke said, his baritone voice sounding rougher in the quiet of the mountains. He laid the folder on the table between them. "And you asked why I knew you had paused school. It wasn't just because I'm thorough, Avonlea. It's because I've been looking for you for 12 years. Avonlea felt the air leave her lungs. She stepped toward the desk, her hands trembling as she reached for the folder. Inside were old flight manifests, maintenance logs from a small airfield in Montana, and a grainy photograph of a man standing in front of a rugged bush plane. The man had her ice blue eyes, and a smile that she had buried deep in her memory. "That's my father," she whispered. "Elias Hart. He was the best pilot I ever employed," Rourke said, standing by the window as he looked out at the dark pines. 12 years ago, I was expanding my logistics network into the Northern Territories. I was young, arrogant, and I had enemies who wanted to see me fail before I started. Your father was flying a shipment of specialized medical supplies, isotopes, that were critical for a research facility I was funding." Rourke turned to look at her, his green eyes filled with a weary, ancient pain. "The plane didn't just crash, Avonlea. It was sabotaged. A fuel line bypass, identical in theory to the sensor manipulation you found today. Elias knew the plane was going down. He had 10 minutes of engine life left. He could have bailed out over the Flathead River and saved himself." Avonlea's breath hitched. She remembered that day, the state troopers at the door, the cold silence of the Montana winter. "He didn't bail," she said, her voice barely audible. "No," Rourke said, his voice dropping to a low frequency of respect. He realized the plane was heading straight for a small mountain schoolhouse. If he let it go, hundreds of children would have died. He stayed at the yoke. He fought that plane until the very last second, guiding it into a barren ravine 500 yards past the playground. He saved those children, but he cost me the only man I ever considered a friend. He stepped closer to her, the amber light catching the sharp lines of his face. "I promised him, as the radio cut out, that I would look after his family. But your mother was proud. She took the insurance money and vanished into the rural counties. I spent years searching for the hearts. When I finally found you 6 months ago, you were serving drinks to men like Brant Holloway to pay for a cancer ward. The anatomy of a debt wasn't about money. It was about a blood oath. Avonlea looked at the logs, seeing her father's neat handwriting next to Rourke's stamps of approval. The Ice King hadn't been watching her like a predator. He had been watching her like a guardian who felt he had failed his greatest hero. I didn't want you to know, Rourke admitted, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. I wanted you to earn your way back to your life so you wouldn't feel beholden to a ghost. But Holloway changed the math. He's using the same shadow tactics that killed your father. I won't let history repeat itself, Avonlea. Not with you. Avonlea looked up at him, the ice in her gaze melting into something fiercer. She wasn't just an engineer fixing a fleet anymore. She was the daughter of a hero, standing next to the man who had carried her father's memory for a decade. The debt was finally laid bare, and as the fire crackled in the hearth, Avonlea realized that the only way to honor the past was to use her mind to secure the future. She reached out and took Rourke's hand, not as a waitress, but as a partner bound by a legacy of steel and sacrifice. Chapter 9. The air at 10,000 feet was a volatile cocktail of ice and adrenaline. Avonlea sat in the co-pilot's seat of the Valkyrie, Rourke's personal long-range interceptor, her hands hovering over a specialized diagnostic console she had integrated into the cockpit's avionics. This wasn't a standard flight. It was a high-altitude trial of the software patch she had written to neutralize the Vance Aerospace kill switch. Beside her, Rourke handled the stick with a calm military precision, his profile etched in the harsh sunlight piercing through the cockpit glass. We're approaching the resonance ceiling, Rourke noted, his baritone steady despite the subtle vibration beginning to rattle the airframe. 32,000 feet. This is where the last 3 stalls occurred. Avonlea watched the scrolling data on her screen. The ultrasound frequencies were rising, climbing toward the fatal 42 kHz mark. She felt her pulse accelerate, her ice-blue eyes scanning the manifold pressure readings. If her logic was flawed, the engines would starve in seconds, leaving them as a billion-dollar glider over the unforgiving peaks of the Continental Divide. The vibration is starting, she whispered. The sensors are reporting a density surge. The computer is trying to cut the fuel. She flicked a toggle on her console. Bypassing the governor now. We're going to manual trim. The engines coughed once, a terrifying mechanical stutter that sent a jolt through the cabin, and then they roared back to life with a fierce, renewed hunger. The green lines on Avonlea's screen stabilized. The ghost had been exorcised. You did it, Rourke said, a rare ghost of a smile touching his lips. But the victory was short-lived. A sharp, rhythmic chirping erupted from the tactical suite. Avonlea's screen flashed red. Rourke, we have a radar lock. 2 bogies rising fast from the valley floor. No transponders. Holloway's contractors, Rourke growled, his hands tightening on the yoke. They weren't just waiting for the engine to fail. They were waiting to ensure there were no witnesses to the crash. A streak of white smoke lunged toward them from the clouds below, an air-to-air missile. Rourke slammed the stick left, putting the Valkyrie into a gut-wrenching bank that sent the diagnostic tablets sliding across the floor. The missile overshot, exploding in a bloom of orange fire against the sapphire sky. They're trying to force us into a dive, Avonlea shouted over the roar of the engines. She saw the 2 sleek, black interceptors closing in on their tail. If we go lower, the air density will trigger the secondary override. Then we go higher, Rourke commanded. He shoved the throttles forward. Avonlea, I need every ounce of thrust those engines have. Forget the safety limits. Overclock the intake. Avonlea's fingers flew across the keyboard, rewriting the fuel injection algorithms in real time. She was no longer just an engineer. She was a combat technician. She felt the Valkyrie surge. Upward, the G-forces pinning her back into her seat. The engines screamed in protest, but they didn't quit. They climbed until the sky turned a deep, dark indigo. The attackers couldn't follow. Their engines, still burdened by the unpatched structural flaw Avonlea had identified, began to shudder and stall in the thin, high-altitude air. One black jet peeled away, its turbine spitting sparks, while the other fell into a flat spin toward the mountains. As the Valkyrie leveled out in the near-silent vacuum of the upper atmosphere, Avonlea exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Rourke, whose eyes were fixed on the horizon, his jaw set in a line of grim satisfaction. They had survived the prototype test, but the message was clear. The war had moved from the boardroom to the sky. The waitress from Montana had just survived her first dogfight, and for the first time, she realized that with Rourke by her side, she wasn't just defending a legacy, she was conquering the air. Chapter 10. The silence of the Rockies following a crash was not peaceful. It was a physical weight, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant rhythmic whistle of the wind through the pines. The Valkyrie lay like a broken bird in a high-altitude basin, its left wing sheared off by a jagged granite tooth during the forced landing. Avonlea blinked, the world swimming in a haze of red and gray. The sharp, acrid scent of hydraulic fluid filled the cabin, a warning that the airframe was no longer a sanctuary. Beside her, Rourke was already moving, his actions dictated by a decade of tactical training. He had a deep gash along his hairline, blood staining the collar of his charcoal suit, but his hands were steady as he unbuckled Avonlea's harness. He didn't ask if she was okay. He looked at her pupils, checked her pulse, and hauled her out of the wreckage before the fumes could overcome them. "We have 30 minutes before the sun drops behind the ridge," Rourke said, his voice a low, grounded rasp that cut through her disorientation. "In this altitude, that means the temperature will drop 40 degrees in an hour. We can't stay with the plane. Holloway's contractors will have our ELT signal, and they won't be coming for a rescue." Avonlea leaned against a snow-dusted boulder, her breath hitching in the thin air. Her survival wasn't just about endurance. It was about the cold, hard logic she had learned in the Montana backcountry. She looked at the wreckage, then at the sky, and finally at the dense tree line 500 yards below them. "The plane's insulation," she said, her voice strengthening as her mind began to map the variables. "The cabin walls are lined with aerogel blankets. If we strip them, we can build a thermal shelter. And the emergency kit in the tail. It has a magnesium starter, but the wood here is too damp to catch." She pointed to the oozing hydraulic line from the broken wing. "That fluid is flammable. We take a pint of it. It'll act as an accelerant for a signal fire if we need it, or a heat source if we don't." Rourke nodded, a flicker of grim approval in his green eyes. He handled the physical labor, using a survival knife to rip the high-tech insulation from the fuselage, while Avonlea scavenged the electronics. She wasn't looking for a radio. She was looking for a way to use the Valkyrie's remaining battery cells to create a perimeter. "They'll use thermal imaging from the air," Rourke noted, his tactical mind already preparing for the hunt. "We need to move under the canopy. The pine needles will mask our heat signature if we layer them over the shelter." As the sky turned a deep, lethal indigo, they retreated into the shadow of the forest. The mountain refuge was a lean-to constructed of downed branches and aerogel silk, tucked into the lee of a massive granite shelf. Inside, the space was cramped, forcing them together. Rourke's heat was a furnace against her side, a reminder of the physical stakes of their alliance. "You're thinking about your father," Rourke said quietly, the darkness of the shelter making his voice feel like it was echoing inside her own head. "I'm thinking about the math," Avonlea replied, though her hand was trembling. "He died in a place like this. He saved those kids, but he was alone." "I'm not alone." Rourke reached out, his large hand covering hers. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, but one of shared resolve. "No, you're the one holding the map now, Avonlea. I know the tactics of the ground, but you know the physics of the sky. We stay alive tonight, and tomorrow we give Holloway a reason to fear the mountains." The wind howled outside their small pocket of warmth, a predatory sound that would have broken a lesser woman. But Avonlea closed her eyes, listening to the steady beat of Rourke's heart and the calculated whistle of the wind, her mind already designing the counterattack they would launch the moment the sun touched the peaks. The Waitress was gone. The survivor had taken her place. Chapter 11. The fire Avonlea had coaxed from the hydraulic fluid and damp cedar was a small flickering heartbeat in the center of their aerogel shelter. Outside, the blizzard had arrived in earnest, the wind screaming against the granite shelf with a fury that made the solid rock seem to tremble. Inside, the world was reduced to 3 feet of shared warmth and the rhythmic, heavy breathing of 2 people who had cheated death twice in a single day. Rourke sat against the back wall, his broad shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the flames. In the orange light, he looked less like the Ice King, and more like a man forged from the very shadows he commanded. The gash on his forehead had stopped bleeding, leaving a dark, jagged crust that made the paleness of his skin more pronounced. For the first time, the suit was gone, the armor of his status stripped away, leaving only the raw, exhaustion-dampened man beneath. Avonlea moved closer, clutching an insulated blanket around her shoulders. She watched the way his hands that controlled the flow of billions in cargo, trembled slightly as he reached out to stoke the embers. It wasn't fear, it was the physical cost of holding a world together. "You're shaking," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the storm. Rourke let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like cracking ice. "It turns out the king of freight is still subject to the laws of thermodynamics, Avonlea. Even I have a freezing point." He turned his head to look at her, his green eyes no longer cold, but weary. "I told myself for 12 years that if I just built a big enough fortress, I could protect everyone. Your father, the driver, you. But here we are, sitting in the dirt while my fleet is grounded and my enemies have the high ground." Avonlea saw the hairline fracture in his composure. He wasn't the villain of the story, the cold, calculating mob boss who used people like chess pieces. He was a man drowning in a debt of honor he could never fully repay. The Ice King persona wasn't a choice. It was a frost shield he'd grown to keep the weight of his responsibilities from crushing him. "You didn't fail him, Rourke," she said, her voice steady and certain. She reached out, her fingers tentatively touching the sleeve of his shirt. "My father chose to stay at that yoke. He knew the risk. He didn't do it for your cargo. He did it because it was the right thing to do. And you've spent 12 years trying to be the man he believed you were." Rourke went still at her touch. He looked down at her hand, then back up at her ice blue eyes. The silence between them shifted, losing its edge of tactical necessity and becoming something softer, something dangerous, in an entirely different way. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned his head back against the stone, a long, ragged exhale escaping his lungs. "I spent my whole life making sure I was the most dangerous person in every room," he admitted, his baritone dropping to a frequency that vibrated through the very floor of the shelter. "But when I saw you standing there in that hangar, looking at that hologram, I wasn't just impressed. I was terrified, because I realized that for the first time in a decade I had found someone I couldn't bear to lose." Avonlea felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She saw the man behind the myth, the vulnerability he had hidden from the world, revealed only to the daughter of the friend he had lost. She realized then that Rourke Callow didn't want to own the sky. He wanted someone to share it with. She moved closer, resting her head on his shoulder, and for a few hours, the storm outside ceased to matter. The first moment of softness had arrived, and in the heart of the Rockies the waitress and the boss found a peace that the city could never offer. Chapter 12. The morning light broke over the granite peaks with a cruel, blinding clarity, but the fire inside the shelter had long since died down to a bed of gray ash. Rourke and Avonlea emerged from the stone shelf not as victims of a crash, but as a unit forged in the sub-zero silence of the night. While Rourke used a satellite beacon scavenged from the Valkyrie's tail to signal a secure extraction team, Avonlea sat on a blackened stump, her laptop balanced on her knees, her fingers moving with a frantic, rhythmic precision, despite the numbness in her tips. She wasn't just checking the damage, she was building a weapon. During the long hours of the storm, she had realized that the kill switch in Rourke's engines wasn't a passive flaw, it was a two-way door. If the engines could receive a signal to stall, they could also be used to trace the source of that signal back to its point of origin. She was designing a Trojan horse script, a piece of code, hidden within the fleet's next maintenance update that would act as a digital flare. "What are you doing?" Rourke asked, his voice low as he scanned the horizon for the silhouette of his rescue helicopters. He stood over her, his presence a shield against the biting wind, his green eyes reflecting the scrolling lines of green and white text on her screen. "I'm turning your fleet into a sonar array," Avonlea replied, her ice blue eyes fixed on a specific string of fuel injection logic. "Brant thinks he owns the frequency that grounds your planes. I'm going to let him think he succeeded. The next time he tries to trigger a stall, this code will stay dormant for 3 seconds, just long enough for his system to think the command was received, before it bounces the signal back to the broadcasting server with a high-intensity data packet." Rourke knelt beside her, his hand resting on the edge of the laptop. "You're giving him a backdoor into my entire logistics network." "No," Avonlea corrected, a cold, sharp smile touching her lips. "I'm giving him a mirror. When he looks for your weakness, he's gonna find his own. This script will harvest his server's IP, his GPS coordinates, and every encrypted communication log he's used to coordinate with Vance Aerospace. It's not a fix, Rourke. It's an indictment." As the distant thrum 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 of the rescue choppers began to vibrate through the mountain air, Avonlea hit the enter key with a finality that felt like a gavel. The architect's move was live. She had taken the very physics they had used to break her father and turned them into a digital noose for Brant Holloway. Rourke looked up at the sky, then back at the girl who had once been invisible. He saw the way she held her head, no longer bowed in service but raised in command. He realized then that he hadn't just saved a waitress, he had unleashed a force of nature. As the extraction team rappelled down toward the snowy basin, Rourke leaned in, his voice a baritone hum against the roar of the rotors. "You've given us the map to his front door," Rourke said, his eyes burning with a dark, lethal pride. "Now let's go see if Brant is ready to pay the price for the sky." The helicopters lifted off, banking away from the wreckage of the Valkyrie. Avonlea watched the mountains shrink below them, her laptop tucked securely under her arm. The trap was set. The Trojan horse was inside the walls, and for the first time in 12 years, the Hart family was the one deciding the altitude. The game had moved from the hangar to the motherboard, and Avonlea was the only one who knew how the story ended. Chapter 13. The aftermath of the crash had left a vacuum in the sky, and in the predatory ecosystem of Colorado's elite, the scent of blood was a summons. While Rourke and Avonlea were still making their way down from the high peaks, a different kind of storm was brewing in the valley. News of the Valkyrie's disappearance had traveled through the shadow networks of the defense industry, with the speed of an electric pulse. To the public, it was a tragic aviation mystery. To the rival contractors, it was an invitation to an inheritance. By the time the rescue transport touched down at a private airfield outside Crestmore Heights, the vultures had already landed. The perimeter of Rourke's primary logistics hub was no longer guarded by his silent uniformed security, but by a fleet of black SUVs belonging to the Vance Aerospace conglomerate. Brant Holloway had not been idle. While Avonlea was fighting the cold, Brant had been weaponizing the law and the fine print of Rourke's land leases. Avonlea stepped off the chopper, her hair matted with dried mountain snow, but her ice-blue eyes were sharper than the wind. She saw the men in tailored suits standing on Rourke's tarmac, clutching legal injunctions like daggers. They weren't just here for the planes anymore. They were here for the land, the strategic mountain passes, and the deep rock hangars that made Rourke Callow the gatekeeper of the West. "They're moving on the logistics easements," Rourke observed, his voice a low, lethal vibration that seemed to rattle the very ground. He didn't look like a man who had just survived a crash. He looked like a god of war returning to find his temple defiled. He ignored the medical team trying to usher him toward an ambulance, his focus locked on the lead contractor standing at the gate, a man named Silas Vane, Brant's primary enforcer in the corporate world. Silas Vane adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, a smug, bureaucratic smile playing on his lips. "Rourke, glad to see you're still with us. We've been notified that since your primary fleet is grounded, and your personal aircraft is a total loss, you are in breach of the safety and reliability clauses of the Crestmore defense contract. Under the terms of the emergency ordinance, Vance Aerospace is authorized to seize the logistics hub for quote, national security maintenance." The air in the airfield grew heavy, a pressure surge that had nothing to do with altitude, and everything to do with the fact that Rourke Callow was being told his empire was no longer his. The vultures weren't just scavenging, they were rewriting the laws of ownership while the king was presumed dead. Avonlea stepped forward, her hand reaching into her pocket to feel the hard edge of the laptop she had used to save their lives. She saw the greed in Vane's eyes, the same greed that had killed her father, and tried to buy her silence. She realized then that the land wasn't just dirt and hangars to these men. It was the final piece of a puzzle that would give Brant Holloway total control over the movement of every supply line in the country. "The safety clauses only apply if the fleet is incapable of flight," Avonlea interjected, her voice cutting through Vane's smug delivery. She didn't look like a waitress or a student. She looked like the architect of Ironvale. "And as of 3 hours ago, the phantom stalls have been identified as a malicious external interference. That's not a breach of contract, Mr. Vane. That's a criminal investigation into your own client." Vane's smile faltered. He looked at the girl in the torn service jacket, then at the tablet she was holding. He didn't know about the Trojan horse or the frequency bypass, but he knew the sound of a woman who held the winning hand. Rourke stepped up beside her, his presence a massive, intimidating wall of shadow. He looked at the black SUVs, the lawyers, and the private security teams. "You have 5 minutes to get off my tarmac," he said, his baritone dropping to a frequency that made the nearby hangar doors vibrate. "Before I decide that your presence here is a threat to my national security." The vultures didn't leave immediately, but the feeding frenzy had been halted. They retreated to their vehicles, the legal papers held a little less tightly. Avonlea watched them go, knowing this was only the first skirmish. The battle for the land had begun, and as she looked at the maps glowing on her screen, she knew that the next move wouldn't be made with lawyers. It would be made on the runway, and it would be a fight for the very soul of the Rockies. The Waitress had outsmarted the billionaire, but now, the daughter of a pilot was going to have to save a kingdom. Chapter 14. The night air at the Crestmore private airfield was a frozen blade, cutting through the thin insulation of the service hangars. Avonlea walked toward the secondary maintenance bay, her breath hitching in rhythmic plumes of frost. She was carrying the encrypted drive, the Trojan horse, that held the digital fingerprints of Brant Holloway's betrayal. She was supposed to meet Rourke's head of security, but as she rounded the tail of a grounded cargo jet, the floodlights suddenly died, plunging the tarmac into a terrifying absolute black. Before she could reach for her phone, a heavy, gloved hand clamped over her mouth. The scent of expensive cologne and industrial grease filled her senses, the signature of Brant's private mercenaries. She struggled, her heels scraping against the grid of the runway, but she was hoisted into the back of a waiting black van. The doors slammed shut with a finality that felt like a coffin lid. "The drive, Avonlea," a voice hissed in the dark. It was Silas Vane. Give us the drive, and you might actually live to see the sunrise over Montana. Avonlea didn't scream. Her mind, trained by years of structural analysis, began to map the internal dimensions of the van. She felt the vibrations of the tires against the asphalt. They weren't leaving the airport. They were heading toward the main runway, the site of the climax, where Brandt intended to finalize his seizure of Rourke's empire. She clutched her laptop bag, her fingers finding a small recessed button on the side of the chassis, a remote override she had built into the fleet's new software. When the van doors finally opened, she was standing on the center line of runway 4, the primary artery of the Rockies' logistics. Brandt Holloway stood there, flanked by armed contractors, his face illuminated by the rotating amber beacons of a massive Vance aerospace freighter idling behind him. Rourke Callow was there too, held at bay by a dozen rifles, his green eyes burning with a cold, lethal fire as he watched them drag Avonlea toward the center of the trap. "It's over, Rourke," Brandt shouted over the scream of the turbines. "The board has already signed the emergency transfer. The land, the fleet, and the girl, they all belong to Vance now. All I need is that drive to erase the evidence of the malfunction, and you're just a ghost in the mountains." He turned to Avonlea, reaching for the bag. "Hand it over, sweetheart. You've played the hero long enough." Avonlea looked at Rourke, then back at Brandt. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like the one who had designed the cage. "You're right, Brandt," she said, her voice steady enough to cut through the wind. "The physics are perfect, but you forgot one thing about resonance. It doesn't just break the wing. It breaks the one holding the remote." She hit the button. Suddenly, every cargo jet on the tarmac, dozens of Rourke's grounded planes, roared to life simultaneously. Their engines didn't just turn over, they began to vibrate at the exact 42 kHz frequency Avonlea had mapped. The sound wasn't a roar, it was a high-frequency scream that shattered the glass of the control tower and sent the contractors to their knees, clutching their ears in agony. In the chaos of the runway trap, the power shifted. The high-frequency pulse didn't just deafen the enemies. It jammed their digital communications and fried the electronics of the Vance freighter. Rourke didn't wait. He lunged forward, his tactical training taking over as he disarmed the nearest guard. Avonlea stood in the center of the storm she had created, the Waitress, who had turned the sky into a weapon. The climax had begun, and as the amber lights flickered in the sonic haze, Brandt Holloway realized too late that he hadn't trapped a girl. He had trapped a lightning bolt. Chapter 15. The high-frequency scream of the engines reached a crescendo that was felt in the marrow of the bone, rather than heard by the ear. On the tarmac of runway 4, the air was a shimmering haze of sonic distortion. Brandt Holloway's contractors, men trained for ballistic warfare but not for the structural violence of acoustics, collapsed in a ragged circle. They clawed at their tactical headsets as the 42 kHz frequency vibrated the very fluid in their inner ears, stripping them of balance and intent. Avonlea stood at the eye of the storm, her thumb braced against the edge of her laptop. She watched the primary display as the Trojan horse script she had written back in the mountain cabin executed its final command. Across the airfield, the massive Vance aerospace freighters, the crown jewels of Brandt's fleet, began to shudder. It wasn't a mechanical failure, it was a digital execution. Avonlea wasn't just stalling them, she was rewriting their flight control laws in real time, locking their landing gear and draining their hydraulic reservoirs into the bypass vents. "The red stress line, Brandt," Avonlea shouted, her voice barely audible over the mechanical shrieking of the fleet. "You used it to fake a failure. Now, I'm using it to make one real." Brandt Holloway was on his knees, his face twisted in a mask of agony and disbelief. He looked up at the massive jet behind him, the one he had planned to use for his escape. The red lights on its fuselage were pulsing in a rhythmic, deathly cadence. The red stress line wasn't just a graphic on a screen anymore. It was the reality of his crumbling empire. His planes were no longer aircraft. They were multi-billion-dollar anchors, grounded by a woman he had once mocked for $1 million tip. Rourke Callow moved through the sonic chaos with the lethal efficiency of a predator whose cage had finally been opened. The noise that crippled the mercenaries only seemed to fuel his focus. He didn't use a gun. He didn't need one. He moved from guard to guard, his strikes heavy and final. A decade of suppressed rage at the vultures, finding its outlet in the freezing Colorado night. When the last of the contractors had been neutralized, Rourke stepped toward Brandt. He didn't rush. He walked with the heavy, rhythmic gait of a man who had already won. He stopped in front of the kneeling billionaire, the amber beacons of the runway casting long, flickering shadows across his bruised face. Rourke reached down and grabbed Brandt by the collar of his expensive overcoat, hauling him to his feet with one hand. "You tried to use the physics of the sky to kill the daughter of a hero," Rourke said, his baritone vibrating even lower than the engines. "But you forgot that the sky doesn't belong to the man with the loudest voice. It belongs to the one who understands its soul." Rourke didn't deliver a final blow. He didn't have to. The sound of sirens began to wail from the north gate. Not the private security of Vance Aerospace, but the state authorities and federal agents Avonlea had alerted through the data packet she bounced back to Brandt's servers. The Trojan horse hadn't just grounded the fleet, it had delivered the evidence of corporate sabotage, the murder of Elias Hart, and the illegal seizure of the logistics hub directly to every major oversight agency in the country. Avonlea closed her laptop, and the engines fell into a sudden, haunting silence. The only sound left was the crackle of the police radios, and the heavy breathing of the man beside her. She looked at Rourke, and for the first time since the hangar, the ice in her eyes was gone. She had grounded the fleet, Rourke had finished the fight, and together, they had finally cleared the smoke from her father's legacy. The red line was gone, and the path forward was finally green. Chapter 16. 6 months later, the glass walls of the Crestmore Heights hangar didn't feel like a cage or a hiding place. They felt like an observation deck for a kingdom reclaimed. The spring air in Colorado was crisp, carrying the scent of melting snow and budding pines, a sharp contrast to the stagnant, expensive smoke of the night Avonlea had first put down her tray. Today, the hangar was not hosted by a posturing billionaire, but by the Hart-Callow Aerospace Foundation. Avonlea stood at the center of the room, her long black hair flowing freely over a tailored navy blazer. She no longer wore the white service jacket of the invisible. Her ice-blue eyes were steady, reflecting the soft glow of the dozens of digital displays showcasing the Foundation's latest initiative. A fleet of high-altitude medical transport drones designed to reach rural Montana communities in minutes. She moved through the crowd with a natural, commanding grace, stopping to speak with researchers and families alike. She wasn't a waitress delivering drinks, she was the architect delivering a future. In the corner of the room, near the same VIP lounge where the $1 million challenge had once been issued, Rourke Callow watched her. He looked less like a man of war, and more like a man at peace, though the lethal sharpness of his presence remained. He had traded the Ice King persona for something more sustainable, a quiet, immovable strength. His logistics empire had been purged of the vultures, and the glass wings had been replaced by a fleet he and Avonlea had rebuilt from the code up. Rourke approached her as the evening began to wind down, the sunset painting the Rockies in shades of gold and copper. He didn't need to say a word. The silent vow they had made in the mountain shelter 6 months ago was still written in the way they stood together. He reached out, his large hand resting briefly on the small of her back, a touch of partnership, not ownership. The oncology wing at Crestmore Memorial has officially cleared its waitlist, Rourke said, his baritone a low, resonant hum. And the board just approved the new flight school for the Montana district. Your father's name is on the hangar door. Avonlea looked up at him, a genuine smile softening the intelligent lines of her face. It's a good start, Rourke, but we have a lot more physics to fix. She looked out at the runway, where the Foundation's first prototype was prepping for a test flight. She realized that she was no longer the girl hiding from her own mind. She was no longer the invisible daughter of a ghost. She was Avonlea Hart, and in a world of men who thought they could buy the sky, she had proven that the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate the quiet person in the room. They had buried the past to build a legacy, and as the jet engines roared to life in a perfect, harmonious frequency, Avonlea knew she was finally exactly where she was meant to be, at the yoke, and in control. If you were moved by Avonlea and Rourke's journey from the shadows to the sky, please smash that like button. Let us know in the comments, what would you have done if you discovered a secret legacy like Avonlea's? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next high-stakes drama. Watch next week for the story of a billionaire who fakes his own bankruptcy to find a real wife. See you in the next one.